My name is Marlene, and I'm 60 minus 3 years old. I've never been someone who causes problems. I grew up in Spokane, Washington, and spent my entire life doing what was right, raising my kids, being a faithful wife, showing up for work even when I was sick. But sometimes life has a way of testing just how much quiet strength a person really has. After my husband passed away, things got harder, but I managed. I lived off his pension, did some sewing on the side, and stayed in the old house we bought when the kids were still in grade school. My daughter Melanie was my baby, always good in school, kept her room clean, never gave me much trouble growing up. She got a full ride to Washington State University, met a guy named Scott in her junior year, and they moved to Bellevue after graduation. Scott worked in tech, making good money. Melanie taught kindergarten for a few years until she had the twins, then decided to stay home full minus time. I was proud of them both. They seemed to have it all figured out. I never wanted to be a burden on anyone, especially not my own daughter. But last year, my world started crumbling. The house I'd called home for decades was falling apart around me. The roof leaked every time it rained, the pipes backed up constantly, and I simply didn't have the money to fix any of it. I was getting sick more often, tired all the time, and the cold Seattle winters made my arthritis flare up so badly that some mornings I could barely drag myself out of bed. That's when Melanie made what seemed like a generous offer. I want to be clear, I never asked for help. She came to me one afternoon, looked around at my leaking ceiling and said, "Mom, just come stay with us. It'll be easier for everyone. You'll be around the grandkids, and we have the space downstairs." Their house was beautiful, one of those newer 2-story homes in a quiet coal-D- sack with manicured lawns and expensive cars in every driveway. They had a finished basement with a small half-bathroom, a pull-out couch, and a mini-fridge. It wasn't fancy, but it would be mine. I packed up my sewing machine, a few boxes of clothes, and some photo albums. That was everything I owned that mattered. I sold my house for barely anything, just enough to cover some old debts and outstanding medical bills. After that transaction was complete, I had nothing left except what I'd brought with me to their basement. But I was determined to pull my weight and prove I deserved to be there. Every single morning, I was up by 6 o'clock. I'd sweep the kitchen floors until they sparkled, pack nutritious lunches for the kids, and make fresh coffee exactly the way everyone liked it. I knew Scott preferred his eggs over easy with just a pinch of pepper. I knew which juice boxes the twins preferred. I ran the dishwasher, folded endless loads of laundry, made beds with hospital corners, and kept that house running like clockwork. After dinner each night, I'd clean up the kitchen, help the kids with their homework, and give Melanie time to take a bath, watch her shows, or just get out of the house for some alone time. I never asked for anything in return. Not money, not recognition, not even a simple thank you. I was just grateful to have a place to belong. But Scott never looked happy to see me. He barely spoke to me at all, and when he did, it was always curt, practical commands. "Can you grab the kids from soccer practice?" Or "Where's my phone charger?" That kind of thing. When I mentioned his coldness to Melanie, she'd always make excuses. "He's just stressed about work," or "It's not personal, Mom. He's just like that with everyone." I believed her because I wanted to. I needed to. Then came that Monday morning that changed everything. I was standing in their pristine kitchen, flipping pancakes on the griddle, humming softly to myself. Scott walked in wearing his expensive work blazer, talking loudly on his phone about some business deal. I turned to pour his coffee, the same way I'd done every morning for 14 months. And that's when he slammed his ceramic mug down on the granite countertop so hard it cracked right down the middle. "Why are you still here?" he said, his voice cold and sharp as winter wind. I thought he was joking at first, maybe having a rough morning at work. I kind of laughed nervously and said, "What do you mean, honey?" He looked me dead in the eyes with a stare that could freeze blood. "I mean in this house. You've been here long enough. We need the space." I looked desperately at Melanie, who had just walked into the kitchen behind him, hoping she'd tell him he was being ridiculous. Instead, she didn't even blink. "We need the room for a home office," she said, her voice flat and matter minus fact, like she was discussing the weather. I stood there with that spatula in my trembling hand, pancakes burning and smoking behind me on the stove. Nobody said anything else. Not "we're sorry." Not "let's talk about this." Not "can we help you find a place?" Just cold, brutal silence. That night, I packed a single bag with one change of clothes, my essential medications, and a warm pair of walking shoes. I didn't even take my sewing machine, the one thing that had always brought me joy and a sense of purpose. I left a note on the basement pillow that simply said, "Thanks for everything." I managed to hold myself together until I reached the downtown homeless shelter. The shelter gave me a bed in a shared room with 3 other women. One snored like a freight train, one never spoke a single word, and one was just 19 years old with a fresh black that told a story I didn't want to imagine. I lay on that thin mattress staring at water stains on the ceiling, thinking over and over, how did I end up here? How do you go from raising a daughter, paying for her braces, working double shifts to buy her prom dress, to sleeping in a homeless shelter at 60-3 years old? But somewhere in those dark, sleepless hours, something crystallized in my mind. They wanted me gone, but they were going to regret exactly how they'd done it. The next morning, I sat on the edge of that cot watching the sun rise through a cracked, dirty window. My back ached, my knees were stiff from the cheap mattress, but my mind was crystal clear. I wasn't going to stay in that shelter forever, not because I was better than anyone else there, but because I had something important to settle first. I stayed quiet for the first few days, not telling anyone my story. I helped clean up after breakfast, folded towels in the laundry room, and kept to myself. The staff liked me because I didn't cause drama or pick fights with other residents. "You're easy, Marlene," they'd say. "No problems." But inside, I was furious, and I was making plans. The first thing I did was call an old friend named Sandra. We'd worked together years ago at a fabric store downtown, and she'd always been good with people. She still worked part-time at the Central Library and had connections throughout the city's social services network. She picked up on the first string. "Marlene, I've been wondering about you. You just disappeared." I didn't tell her everything, just that I was temporarily out of the house, needed work, and required a quiet place to think through my options. She immediately offered to meet for coffee and said she could connect me with someone at the library who specialized in helping seniors navigate housing applications and job assistance programs. That meeting changed the entire trajectory of my situation. Sandra's friend Deb was a retired paralegal who volunteered her time helping seniors navigate complicated city paperwork and legal issues. She looked over my situation carefully, and when I explained exactly what had happened, how I'd sold my home, moved in with family, provided free childcare and housekeeping for over a year, and was then kicked out without any notice, she raised her eyebrows with interest. "Did they give you any kind of lease agreement?" she asked. "No," I replied. "Did they charge you rent?" "No, but I gave up my home and lived there for 14 months, providing full minus-time services." She leaned back in her chair, a knowing look crossing her face. "You may have a legal case here." At first, I didn't understand what she meant, but Deb explained that Washington State has specific laws protecting people, even family members, from being suddenly evicted without proper notice, especially if they gave up property, were promised housing, or provided valuable services like caregiving in exchange for accommodation. I wasn't trying to sue anyone or get rich quick, but hearing that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't crazy for feeling completely used and discarded that validation did something profound to my sense of self minus worth. We got to work immediately. She helped me document absolutely everything I could remember. I wrote out detailed daily routines I'd performed for them. I printed text messages where Melanie had said things like, "We really need you here, and don't worry about finding your own place. You'll be living with us now." I found photographs of me doing laundry, picking the kids up from school, cooking elaborate family dinners. I even had a receipt from when I'd bought new cookware for their kitchen with my own limited money. Then Deb asked me something that stopped me cold. "Did you know your daughter and her husband recently applied for a substantial home equity line of credit?" I had no idea what she was talking about, but she pulled up public records on her laptop and showed me documentation proving they'd drawn almost $5,000 against their home's value just a few weeks before I was kicked out. "People don't pull out that much cash just for a home office," she said quietly. That's when the pieces started falling into place. They didn't actually need my basement room for workspace. They needed me gone before their financial situation got worse. Maybe Scott's tech job wasn't as stable as he pretended. Maybe they were hiding serious money problems. Maybe they were facing something much worse than I'd realized. I didn't know the full truth yet, but I was absolutely determined to find out. So I waited patiently and built my case methodically. I kept attending appointments, gathering evidence, and staying under the radar. After 6 weeks in the shelter, I qualified for transitional housing, nothing fancy, just a small room with a lock and a hot plate, but it was mine. I found part-time work at a dry cleaner 3 days a week, just enough to cover basic groceries and bus fare. Then one afternoon, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a bright yellow letter from the city posted directly on their front door: notice of code violation, minus occupancy review required. It turns out you can't simply convert a basement into a home office and start writing it off as business property on your tax returns, especially when it's still technically listed as residential living space for a dependent adult. Someone had filed an anonymous complaint with the city planning department. Not me directly, of course, but let's just say Deb knew exactly how to word such a complaint to trigger an official investigation. The city opened a comprehensive review. They requested permits, architectural blueprints, and detailed occupancy history. A neighbor told the inspector that an older woman used to live in the basement who took care of the children full minus time and had suddenly vanished without explanation. That single piece of testimony opened the door much wider. But I wasn't finished yet. I discovered something even more damaging. Scott had officially listed me as a live minus and caregiver on their previous year's tax return. Why would he do such a thing? Because there's a significant federal deduction available for dependent care if you have a relative living with you who provides child care or elder support services. He'd filed that paperwork months before they told me to leave, claiming thousands of dollars in deductions using my name and social security number. I printed every piece of documentation I could find and filed my own detailed report with the Internal Revenue Service. After I submitted that IRS complaint, things moved with frightening speed. Deb helped me compile a comprehensive packet of evidence: screenshots, printed text messages, detailed timelines, even voice recordings I had from leaving voicemails that mentioned watching the kids full minus time while their parents worked or traveled. Don't feel guilty about this, she told me firmly. You're not turning them in for revenge. You're simply correcting lies that cost you your home and dignity. Still, I felt physically sick the day I mailed everything to the federal agency. But I passed the point of no return. Meanwhile, the city investigation kept expanding. They weren't just examining the basement home office conversion anymore. A sharp-eyed clerk had flagged that the property was zoned and listed as single-minus family residential use, but the basement clearly had its own separate lock, kitchenette, and completely private living space. If someone had been residing there for over a year, it could legally qualify as an illegal rental unit requiring special permits and inspections. Scott and Melanie tried desperately to argue they had never rented the space to anyone. But then the city inspector found something devastating Melanie had posted in a local Facebook housing group several months earlier, advertising the basement space to a quiet, professional female, describing it as move minus and ready with private entrance. She'd been trying to replace me with a paying tenant before they even kicked me out. But the worst revelation was still coming. 2 weeks after I'd submitted my IRS fraud complaint, I received a phone call from a woman named Julia who worked for a private agency that audits dependent care claims for insurance companies. She had some routine questions about my supposed employment as a live minus and caregiver. I told her the absolute truth: I was never officially employed, never signed any contracts, never received payment, and had never even known I was listed as an employee anywhere. She went completely silent on the phone for several long seconds. Then she asked me to confirm whether I'd health insurance coverage through Scott's employer plan. What do you mean? I asked, confused. It turned out Scott had also listed me as a dependent on his private insurance plan through work. He had been submitting and getting reimbursed for prescription medications and medical appointments under my name. The problem was I hadn't been to a doctor or filled a prescription since leaving their house months earlier. He'd been using my social security number and personal information to commit insurance fraud. I felt like I couldn't breathe. Not only had they used me for free labor, kicked me out without warning, and lied to city officials, but they had been actively stealing my identity for financial gain. Deb helped me file an immediate report with the State Insurance Commission. We also went directly to the local police precinct to speak with a detective in the fraud division. This wasn't just tax evasion anymore, it was systematic identity theft, which carried serious felony penalties. Through all of this escalating drama, Melanie never called me. Not once. Not after the yellow letter appeared on their door, not after the IRS audit began, not after the insurance company flagged him for suspicious claims. Complete radio silence. But I knew they were feeling the pressure building. Sandra told me she'd run into Scott at a gas station and said he looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. His credit card was declined 3 times at the pump before he finally found one that worked. I didn't smile when she told me that story, but I felt something shift inside me, like my spine was finally straightening after being bent for too long. I thought that would be enough satisfaction. That watching them get caught and face consequences would bring me the closure I needed. But then came the twist that changed everything. It involved the twins, my grandchildren. I ran into their elementary school teacher at the grocery store one afternoon. She recognized me from the countless times I'd picked them up from school and smiled warmly. She leaned in close and whispered, "They haven't been in school all week. Is everything okay at home?" I felt as water flood my veins. I hadn't seen the kids since the morning I left that house. I'd assumed they were fine, that Melanie and Scott were taking care of them despite their legal troubles. But now I was learning they'd been missing school entirely. I tried to play it casual, saying I hadn't seen them lately but would check in. But the worry began eating at me immediately. That night, I sat in my tiny transitional housing room thinking terrible thoughts. What if things were much worse than I'd realized? What if my investigation was somehow hurting innocent children? What if I was so focused on justice that I'd lost sight of what really mattered? I called Deb and told her I needed to reconsider everything. She didn't try to talk me out of it. She just said gently, "Marlene, you deserve to be safe and treated with dignity. But you also deserve peace of mind. You're not the one who put those children in danger. Their parents made these choices." I nodded, but it didn't make the guilt disappear. Because now I was wondering if Melanie hadn't just kicked me out to make room for an office. What if Scott had forced her hand? What if there were darker things happening in that house that I didn't know about? What if those innocent kids were caught in the middle of something truly dangerous? I couldn't sleep that entire night. I kept thinking about the twins, wondering if they were safe, if they were scared, if they even had enough food to eat. By morning, I'd made my decision. I wasn't backing down from holding Scott and Melanie accountable, but I needed to know immediately what was happening to those children. Not for Melanie's sake, not for Scott's sake, for the kids who'd never asked to be born into this mess. I called Child Protective Services and calmly explained what I knew. I gave them the school name, information about the missed attendance, details about the ongoing city violations, and the fact that I'd lived in that house as a caregiver but hadn't seen the children in several weeks despite previously caring for them daily. I wasn't hysterical or vindictive. I simply told them the truth. Something felt very wrong, and those kids needed someone to check on their welfare. CPS opened an emergency welfare check that same day. Less than 12 hours later, I received a phone call from Detective Reardon, the officer who'd been helping me with the insurance fraud case. His tone was completely different this time, urgent and deeply concerned. He told me that CPS workers and local police had gone to the house for the wellness check. No one had answered the front door despite multiple knocks and an official announcement of their presence. But they could hear children crying inside the house. The back door had been left wide open, unlocked. The house was in complete chaos, piles of dirty dishes, filthy laundry everywhere, unpaid bills and legal notices scattered across every surface. The twins were there alone, hungry and frightened, with no adult supervision anywhere. A neighbor reported that Scott had left 2 days earlier, carrying suitcases and looking like hell. No one had seen Melanie in over 20 minus for hours. They found her later that evening at a cheap motel outside Redmond. She was intoxicated, disoriented, and incoherent. When they asked about her children, she just kept repeating through tears, "I don't know what to do anymore. I don't know what to do." Everything exploded after that revelation. The city immediately declared the house unfit for occupancy due to multiple code violations and safety hazards. Scott was formally charged with tax fraud, insurance fraud, and identity theft, 3 separate felony counts. His tech company fired him as soon as the criminal charges became public record. Their bank accounts were frozen pending the federal investigation. The IRS moved aggressively to collect back taxes, penalties, and interest on the fraudulent deductions. Scott tried desperately to blame everything on Melanie, claiming she'd handled all the paperwork, but his name was on most of the official documents. He was the one who'd submitted the false tax returns. He was the one who'd used my social security number without permission. Melanie temporarily lost custody of the twins. Child Protective Services placed them with a licensed foster family while they conducted a full investigation into the home environment and parental fitness. But then the family court judge said something that completely stunned me. The court is willing to explore kinship placement if the grandmother is willing and has been determined fit to provide care. I'd never even considered that possibility. I thought maybe they'd never let me see those kids again after everything that had happened. But they were actually asking me directly, was I willing to take custody? I said yes without hesitation. The process was intensive and thorough. Background checks, home inspections, hours of paperwork. interviews with social workers, parenting classes designed for grandparents raising grandchildren. It took several months of evaluation. I had to move into a larger senior apartment that was approved for kinship cases involving minor children. I had to prove I could handle the physical, emotional, and financial responsibilities of raising two active kids in their elementary school years. I did everything they required without complaint. And then one quiet Tuesday afternoon, I walked into a sterile government office on the second floor of the county building, and those beautiful twins came running straight into my arms. They were crying, shaking, clearly traumatized by months of instability and uncertainty, but they were finally safe. I didn't make them any grand promises about perfect lives or fairy tale endings. I just held them tight and told them the simple truth: I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere ever again. As for Scott, he ultimately faced 3 felony charges in federal court. He took a plea deal to avoid prison time, but he'll be paying financial restitution for the rest of his natural life. His career in tech is completely finished. No company will hire someone with fraud convictions on their record. Melanie filed for divorce shortly after Scott's arrest. She tried to petition for partial custody of the children, but the family court ordered her to complete a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation and substance abuse counseling program before they'd even consider reviewing her request. I didn't try to block her from having supervised visits with the kids, but I made it crystal clear that I would never allow her to hurt them the way she'd hurt me. When she came to visit for the first time, she stood on my doorstep in the pouring rain with no makeup, no fancy clothes, just a broken woman holding a paper bag with a stuffed rabbit inside. She looked at me with hollow eyes and said, "I don't even know who I am anymore." I looked right back at her and replied calmly, "You'll figure it out eventually. But you're not doing it here." She didn't argue or make a scene. She just nodded, walked back to her car, and drove away into the gray Seattle afternoon. I didn't cry, and I didn't scream. I simply closed the door, made dinner for my grandchildren, and sat down at our small kitchen, able to help them with homework. Later that evening, they asked me if I was okay, these resilient, perceptive children who'd been through so much chaos. I smiled and told them the absolute truth: I am no. I never planned on revenge when this whole nightmare began. I just wanted a safe place to live out my remaining years with dignity. But when they threw me away like I didn't matter, like I was disposable garbage, they forgot something crucial about the kind of person I really am. You don't step on the one person who cleaned your floors every day, raised your children with love, and held your entire family together just to make room for a desk in your basement. Because sometimes the quiet ones, the ones who never cause problems, who always do what's right, who sacrifice everything for family, sometimes were the ones who will methodically burn your whole world down and rebuild it from scratch when you push us too far. And we'll do it with the same careful attention to detail that we used to fold your laundry and pack your lunches. The twins are thriving now. They're back in school, making friends, laughing again. They call me Grandma Marlene, and every morning when I make their breakfast, I remember why some battles are worth fighting. Not for revenge, but for love. Not to destroy, but to protect what matters most. Sometimes justice wears the face of a 60-3- old grandmother who refused to disappear quietly into the night.